Hi, I'm Tom at Just One Pack, and this is AC on the Short Alpha Clash podcast, where I talk all things Alpha Clash on my way to work. Now, this weekend we had the Progenitors gambit in the Philippines, 1 week after the one in the US, and we can now compare the two and see how the meta evolves. Well, that made me think, and I'm going to quickly round out what happened in the Philippines. But that made me think about what makes a meta different in one location than the other. So let's dig into all of that. Just a quick mention though, at the very beginning, the audiobook for The Awakening, the novel, sort of laying the groundwork, at least for the first 5 sets of Alpha Clash, has now been released on Audible. Go have a listen. It is exactly as good as the book used to be, but now it has a high quality audio track as well. So the meta in the Philippines and the meta in the US was both different and the same. So some of the things that we saw in the US, I mentioned this last week's episode, was the dominance of Lord Krung as a contender. Now, Lord Krung completely owned that competition, being all 4 in the top 4 and being played by something approaching half of the players there. Right. So clearly, he is so strong that he must dominate the Philippines as well. Well, yes, and certainly us. A certain also a no. So what happened in the Philippines was that Lord Krung actually did win. So far it's supposed that he should be dominating it. But the top 4 in the Philippines was only one Krung. I think that can't remember exactly. I think the top 8 had 2 Krungs, and then it went down to 1. So not nearly as dominant as in the US. Now that made me think about what is it that makes it so different, because often when we talk about a meta, or talk about meta defining, I've done this in tier lists on this channel as well, right? When we are talking about something being meta defining, we usually look at the contenders, or this contender will be an S tier contender who completely ruin the meta and sort of determine what is going on there. And while that is partially true, that a really strong contender will influence the meta, there are, at least, or maybe even more so in Alpha Clash, a lot more going on, right? So Lord Krung is a strong contender. I, as far as I remember, he has always been, since the release, of course, been close to or at the top 16, maybe even top 8 often. So he's a strong contender, no doubt about that. But there are other strong contenders. I mean, in the very beginning, Talk was completely dominating the Philippines base, and Genesis sort of came in and took over a lot of that room that Talk was occupying. Right? So there are some of these. So now we reach to the first organized play event where we could see Alpha Aster come into play, and he was nerfed just prior to that, as I mentioned last week. Maybe because he was nowhere to be found, or hardly. I can't remember if there were any Alpha Aster players, but I don't recall there being. There might be 1 or 2, right? So he was completely missing from the meta, and we have, I think all of us, predicted that he would be meta defining. Now he was nerfed, as I mentioned, and the event card somewhere in this case Des Moines for the US and Quezon City for the Philippines, had a huge impact on how much he would have impacted the game as a whole. So that small change altered what I think is some of what I think altered the meta completely. Right? But but that is only part of it. At least that's my claim here. So strong cards do have an effect. There's a reason why we don't see a black Moxie going top 8, right? Strong cards have an effect on what is in the meta anywhere, almost anywhere. But I think there are other factors too. One of them is players. So to my understanding, the US is to some extent, the US scene is to some extent having, I'm going to call them teams, right? That train together and hone their skills together and deck build to an extent together, which also means there will be a more equal footing in terms of what goes in the decks and what does not. Now, I understand that it is to some extent the same in the Philippines. This is the way most of us play. We have a group with whom we play, and we can do that to different extents. But their take on it is different, and doesn't in the same degree maybe dominate what is being played, right? So having those groups and those players specifically that are good at a certain strategy I would claim has a huge impact on the meta as well. Point here to support that point. In the Philippines, there was a lot more difference between what contenders were played, right? And a lot of that came down to that some of the players that we usually see make top 8, of course, are the same people who make top 8. So someone like Furious Chicken was running a Magnate, right? And Magnate is not even on the radar in the US, but he is such a good player that he overcame quite a few of the obstacles that may or may not have taken him out because he was a better player, at least from my understanding, right? I don't want to. There might have been a better player with a worse draw, what do I know? But if you can consistently make it to the top 16 in this case, maybe it's just because you're the better player. Now, there's a reason for it always being the same players at the top tier. That's because they're good, right? And the choices they make will affect the meta. So my postulate is that a good player with a mediocre deck will beat a bad player with a good deck, right? But also, what style of play you lean towards have an impact. So, example, I have built a Lin deck to diminish my opponents. I am very certain that if I were to play that against, again, I have what I would consider less powerful deck but a better player, I am losing. The reason being that I cannot. If I were to play that against a deck of equal strength but and an equal good player, I would lose more than 50% of the time because the strategy of that deck does not lean towards what I usually would play or how I would play the game normally. Now, I can try and force it a bit and I can play that style to an extent, but it's not my quote-unquote natural state, right? So which players are the good players in a local scene will be a factor in determining the meta. That was one of the points. The third thing is there is sort of a life. So the thing with metas are that or is that it is a local thing, semi-local but local thing. Semi-local meaning that when you when you go to Awakenings, there is a meta there, right? It can be influenced by what is on a higher tier level in competitive play or organized play, but it has its own life, right? The players that show up are different, therefore the meta will be different. But I think there's thing more to it. Uh, the thing is, the thing more is this local scene, how it reacts to uh, to what the choices the best players are making, or what type of best players we have. So if you're in a meta that is heavily Krung, as in Europe, what I think we will see, if that is true at the local level as well, is is counterplays, right? So there will be decks specifically created to manage or counter that win condition in order to try and win enough games to get that under control, right? Having that back and forth works if the local scene is of fairly equal players, right? If you can actually take a loss if you win other games, right? You're fairly evenly matched, then that will have an impact as well. Or you will follow along the top tier deck in your local meta. So that too, the reaction to whatever pops up is also a factor in what defines the meta. And one of the fun things about that is that if you look at the deck lists or the decks from the US Progenitors Gambit and the Philippine Progenitors Gambit, and actually we can go back because this is more or less true. From my observance, without doing statistics, this is more or less true all the way around or way back, right? That while the US meta is almost always two colors, the Philippine meta is almost always three colors. There are two color decks in the Philippines. There are monocolored, single colored decks in I guess both the US and Philippines. So they all do exist, but the high tier players are playing dual colors in the US and three colors in the Philippines, which is a design choice, right? Which is really interesting. That too will have an impact. I think it has an impact because they want to me, it seems like a reaction to a setup, a reaction to the meta that was playing out locally. That you need answers, and those answers may not come in the color of your preferred color or your preferred colors. You have to sort of splash in a third color to get those answers in, or get the right answers in. But that seeing that is curious to me, right? Why is it that this is? And I think that is the local life of the game, that different players or different environments of players find different solutions to it. Right. Anyway, that was my thoughts on what creates a meta. I'd be really, really curious because here's the thing: we don't have a European meta, right? We sort of have a US meta now within the limits of the Progenitors Gambit. We can look at the clash grounds around to get an idea, or we could go all the way back to ClashCon and the Pro Tour to see what is the meta in the US. And the same is true for the Philippines, and those are sort of the two major pinnacles, right? In the world of Alpha Clash, those are the two big playgrounds. What we are seeing is, of course, the UAE is starting to grow. I'm afraid that Australia sort of dropped off a little bit, but what we are seeing is the awakening coming to Europe, both literally and metaphorically, right? In late June, the first awakening in Europe will be held on the Leaky Teacup in the UK, and it'd be really interesting to see what shows up there. What are people playing there? And I'm fortunate enough to be able to compare it to what we play locally. We just played a sealed with Equilibrium. It's going to be really fun to see what will be played there, right? So really, really, really interesting to see how that plays out and what will be played at the Awakening Europe, because that will be the first indicator for European meta. Right? Anyway, I hope I'll see you there if you have the chance to go. Otherwise, I'll talk to you here soon. Bye.